Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a medieval workshop, and I need you to understand something right. No, you're not gonna make it. I don't care how many blacksmithing videos you've watched on YouTube, or how authentic your Renaissance fair costume is, or how confidently you think you could hammer out a horseshoe. The reality of medieval craft work would break you before lunch. Picture this. You're standing in a dim stone building that smells like burning hair, rotten eggs, and desperation. Your hands are already blistered from tools that weigh more than your laptop. The master craftsman, a man with forearms like tree trunks and the temperament of a sleep-deprived Wolverine, is screaming at you in a dialect you barely understand because you held the hammer wrong. It's not even 7 a.m. You haven't eaten, and this is considered a good day. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing this community span the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing that would destroy you is the schedule itself. You think your morning alarm is brutal? Medieval workshops operated on what historians call sunlight hours, which is a polite way of saying you worked every moment the sun was up, plus a few hours on either side just for fun. In summer, that meant 14 to 16-hour days. In winter, you got a merciful reduction to maybe 10 or 11 hours, but only because candles were expensive and your master wasn't about to waste tallow on the likes of you. There was no weekend. The concept didn't exist in the way we understand it. Sure, you got Sundays off for church because eternal damnation was the only thing medieval society took more seriously than profit, but you also got random saints' feast days off, which sounds generous until you realize you weren't paid for those days. And missing work meant missing food. Your alarm clock is the guild bell, a massive bronze monster hanging in the town center that clangs at hours designed to punish the human spirit. In summer, that first bell rings around 4 a.m. in the morning. And here's the thing, you can't just roll over and ignore it. You're sleeping in the workshop itself, probably on a straw pallet in the corner that you share with 2 other apprentices and a family of mice who've been there longer than you have. The moment that bell rings, the master is stomping through the workspace, literally kicking apprentices awake. This isn't an exaggeration. Historical records from guild regulations in 14th century Florence explicitly mention masters being allowed to use reasonable physical correction to rouse apprentices, which included kicking, cold water, and in one memorable case, a master blacksmith who kept a bucket of quenching water specifically for dumping on sleeping boys. You stumble to your feet in complete darkness. If you're lucky, someone's already got a rushlight burning, basically a reed soaked in animal fat that produces light roughly equivalent to a dying firefly and smoke that makes your eyes water. You're wearing the same wool tunic you wore yesterday because you only own 2, and the other one is currently crusted with yesterday's work filth and needs scraping before you can wear it again. Medieval people did not have the relationship with laundry that we do. Water was for drinking and working, not for something as frivolous as cleaning clothes every day. You smell like sweat, smoke, and whatever material your workshop specializes in. A blacksmith's apprentice carried the scent of coal smoke and hot metal. A tanner's apprenticio, you poor soul, smelled like decomposing flesh and urine because those were literally the chemicals used to process leather. There's a reason tanners had to set up shop outside town walls. Breakfast, if you can call it that, happens while you're already working. You grab a hunk of dark bread so dark and dense it could be used as a weapon and maybe dip it in whatever thin ale or watered wine is available. Medieval people didn't drink much water because most water sources in towns were contaminated with all manner of biological nasties. Small beer or ale was safer, though calling it beer is generous. This was weak, yeasty, barely alcoholic liquid that tasted like someone's sock water. But it was wet, it had calories, and it wouldn't give you dysentery, so you drank it and pretended it was fine. Sometimes you got cheese. Medieval cheese was an experience hard enough to require gnawing, salty enough to cure leather, and aged in conditions that would violate every modern health code. But it was protein, and in a world where meat was a luxury for apprentices, you took what you could get. Now you're standing at your workstation, and the master is already barking instructions. Here's something modern people don't understand about medieval craftsmanship. There were no instruction manuals. None. Zero. Not even diagrams. Every trade secret, every technique, every trick of the craft existed exclusively in the master's head and in the muscle memory of those he chose to teach. This was intentional. Guilds carefully controlled knowledge because knowledge was power, and power meant money. A master goldsmith in 13th century Paris could charge enormous sums precisely because he was one of maybe 40 people in the entire city who knew how to properly alloy gold with silver to create specific colors. If that knowledge became common, prices would drop. So everything you learned by watching, by trying, by failing, and by getting smacked when your failures wasted materials. The teaching method was called mimetic learning, which is a fancy academic term for figure it out yourself while I yell at you. You watched the master or a senior journeyman perform a task maybe once, twice if you were incredibly fortunate. Then you attempted it yourself. Your first efforts were inevitably disasters. That's expected. What's not expected in our modern world is the response to failure. Today, a teacher might say, "Good try, let's work on your technique." A medieval master would say he probably wouldn't say anything intelligible. Just make a sound somewhere between a growl and a sigh. Then demonstrate the correct method again with exaggerated, mocking slowness as if you were the stupidest creature ever to hold a tool. Historians still argue whether this teaching method was deliberately harsh to toughen apprentices or simply reflected a culture where physical punishment was so normalized that nobody thought twice about it. Let's talk about what you're actually making, because medieval workshops weren't quaint artisan studios, they were production facilities. A busy blacksmith shop in a decent-sized town might need to produce 20 horseshoes a day, plus nails, hinges, tools, and whatever custom work wealthier clients demanded. A weaver's workshop operated multiple looms simultaneously, with apprentices and journeymen working in coordinated rhythm to meet contracts for cloth that might be shipped hundreds of miles away. The pace was relentless because the economics were brutal. Your master had rent to pay, materials to buy, guild fees to satisfy, and his own family to feed. You, the apprentice, represented free labor, but only if you produced enough to offset the cost of keeping you alive. The pressure creates an atmosphere of constant anxiety. You're hyper-aware that every mistake costs your master money, and his response to losing money is taking it out on you, sometimes literally. A ruined piece of work might mean no supper. A serious error-breaking and expensive tool. Burning a noble's commission could mean a beating that leaves you unable to work for days. And here's the darkest part. This was legal. Completely, utterly legal. Apprenticeship contracts from medieval England, France, Germany, and Italy all contain clauses explicitly granting masters the right to correct apprentices physically. Some contracts even specified that parents couldn't sue for injuries sustained during normal instruction, which apparently included broken fingers, burns, and concussions. You're learning this in the pre-dawn darkness. Hands already aching, stomach growling around a belly full of bread and bad beer, while the master paces behind you like a predator. The workshop is cold. Fires aren't built up fully yet because fuel costs money and you can see your breath in the air. Your fingers are stiff, which makes precise work nearly impossible. But that's not an excuse. It's never an excuse. The other apprentices around you are focused with the intensity of people who know that attracting negative attention means pain. Nobody talks unless necessary. The only sounds are tools on materials, hammers on metal, blades on leather, shuttles through looms. Each percussion a reminder that you're now part of a machine designed to transform materials and labor into profit. And we haven't even discussed the actual skills yet. Whatever craft you've stumbled into and you didn't choose it, your parents sold you into this apprenticeship when you were somewhere between 7 and 14 years old requires a level of physical coordination and strength that modern people simply don't possess. A blacksmith's hammer weighs 3 to 5 pounds, and you'll swing it thousands of times a day. Your shoulder will scream. Your elbow will develop tendinitis. Your wrist will swell. And you'll keep swinging because stopping means you're useless. And useless apprentices get sent home in disgrace, which means your family wasted the premium they paid for your placement. And you've brought shame on everyone you know. A weaver's work destroys your fingers in different ways: the constant fine movements, the thread cuts, the repetitive stress of throwing shuttles. After a few months, experienced weavers develop calluses on their fingertips so thick they can barely feel anything, which is probably a mercy given how often those fingers get stabbed by needles and scraped by rough wool. The quirky reality that most people don't know is that many medieval workshops operated on a task-based system rather than strict hourly schedules. This sounds flexible and nice until you realize it meant you worked until the day's quota was met, regardless of how long it took. A blacksmith's workshop might have a contract to deliver 50 hinges by week's end. If you're ahead of schedule, great, you might get to stop at sunset. If you're behind because someone got sick, or materials were delayed, or a piece cracked and needed redoing, then you're working until midnight by expensive candlelight. And the cost of those candles will come out of the meager allowance you might eventually receive. Spoiler, you're always behind schedule. Something always goes wrong. That's just the nature of working with medieval technology, medieval materials, and medieval logistics. By the time the sun actually rises, probably around 6 or 7 a.m., depending on the season, you've already been working for hours. Your clothes are soaked with sweat despite the cold because physical labor in heavy wool is its own kind of torture. Your hands are cramping. Your back aches from hunching over workbenches built for men 6 inches shorter than modern humans because medieval nutrition meant medieval people were, on average, significantly smaller than us. Everything hurts, and you're not even close to halfway through your day. The master might grunt something approximating approval if you've managed not to completely destroy everything you've touched. But don't expect praise. Praise was rare in medieval workshops, reserved for truly exceptional work or moments when a master wanted to motivate you towards some especially difficult task. The truly crushing part is the knowledge that this is day one of approximately 555 days. That's 7 years, the standard apprenticeship length for most guilds. 7 years of this exact routine, varying only slightly with seasons and feast days. 7 years before you can even attempt to become a journeyman, which comes with its own special miseries we'll explore later. Some apprenticeships lasted longer. Goldsmiths and specialized armorers might require 10 or even 12 years because the skills were so intricate and the guilds so protective of their knowledge. Imagine signing a contractor more accurately, having your parents sign a contract on your behalf that binds you to this existence until you're in your 20s, with no escape clause, no weekend mental health breaks, no calling in sick unless you're literally dying. And people wonder why medieval mortality rates were so high. This lifestyle, which we're only one section into describing, aged people rapidly. A 40-year-old master craftsman often looked 60 by modern standards, bent back, gnarled hands, missing teeth from poor nutrition and non-existent dental care, probably deaf in one ear from years of hammering or machinery. You look at this man, and this is your future if you survive. That's the prize waiting at the end. The privilege of becoming the person who now gets to torture a new generation of apprentices while your body falls apart from decades of abuse. But it's barely mid-morning on day one, and you're already fantasizing about sleep. The irony is that when you finally do get to sleep, probably 15 or 16 hours from now, you'll be so physically exhausted that you'll pass out on that straw pallet despite the mice, despite the snoring of other apprentices, despite the cold, despite everything. Medieval people didn't have insomnia the way we do. When your body is pushed to the absolute limit of physical endurance every single day, sleep isn't something you struggle with, it's something that claims you the moment you stop moving. That's not rest. That's collapse. But it's all you get, so you take it, and when that bell rings at 4 a.m. again, the nightmare begins anew. The morning light is filtering through the workshop's small windows now, and yes, they're small because glass was expensive and large windows meant heat loss in winter. You can finally see what you're doing without straining, which means the master will expect faster, more precise work. The day is just beginning to reveal its full horror. Your stomach is already growling again because that bread and ale were hours ago, and the next meal won't come until midday, if you're lucky. Your throat is dry from the dust and smoke that fill the air. We'll talk more about the atmospheric horrors later. But know that with every breath, you're inhaling particles that are slowly destroying your lungs. Your eyes itch from lack of sleep and smoke exposure. Every muscle in your body is tensing against the knowledge that you have 10, 12, maybe 14 more hours of this ahead of you. Welcome to day one. You're already broken, and we've only just begun. The fantasy version of medieval apprenticeship involves a kindly old craftsman teaching eager young students the secrets of a noble trade, everyone working together in harmony, maybe breaking for a hearty stew at lunch while the master tells amusing stories. The reality is that you've been purchased. Let's be clear about this. Your parents paid a premium, sometimes as much as a year's wages, to legally transfer you into what amounts to indentured servitude. The apprenticeship contract they signed gives your master nearly absolute authority over your body, your time, and your future for the next 7 years. You can't quit. You can't switch trades. You can't even get married without permission. You are property with just enough legal personhood to be punished when you inevitably fail to meet impossible standards. The contract itself would horrify any modern labor lawyer. A typical 14th century apprenticeship agreement from London's Guild records reads something like this: John Miller, son of Robert Miller, binds himself to Master William Wright, carpenter, for 7 years. The apprentice shall faithfully serve, keep his master's secrets, do no damage, waste nothing, and obey all lawful commands. He shall not play dice, visit taverns, or commit fornication. The master shall teach the craft, provide food, lodging, and clothing as befits an apprentice. Notice what's missing? any mention of education quality, safety, or limitations on punishment. Notice what's included? Total control over your social life. That bit about fornication wasn't just moral posturing if you got someone pregnant or got pregnant yourself. You could be expelled from your apprenticeship with no refund to your parents and no compensation for years of labor already completed. Your living conditions would make a modern prison cell look comfortable. You sleep in the workshop itself, usually in whatever corner can be spared from actual production. Sometimes there's a loft above the main floor where apprentices are stacked like cordwood on straw pallets. These pallets aren't mattresses in any meaningful sense of theory, literally cloth sacks stuffed with straw that gets replaced maybe once every few months when it's been compressed into something resembling dense cardboard and has accumulated enough vermin that even medieval standards are offended. You share this sleeping space with anywhere from 2 to 6 other apprentices, depending on the workshop size. Personal space is not a concept. You sleep shoulder to shoulder with boys who smell as bad as you do, who snore, who have lice, who occasionally wet themselves because they're too exhausted to wake up and stumble outside to the piss pot. Speaking of which, nighttime bathroom arrangements are their own special nightmare. There's no indoor plumbing, obviously. Most workshops have a chamber pot or bucket that gets emptied in the morning into the street or a communal cesspit. But this bucket serves everyone, master, journeyman, apprentices, and it gets full. Really full. By morning, it's often overflowing. And if you're the youngest or newest apprentice, guess whose job it is to carry that sloshing horror through the workshop and dump it? The smell alone is enough to make you gag. But you can't show weakness. The other apprentices are watching for any sign that you're soft, because the apprentice hierarchy is as vicious as any prison yard social structure. Here's something historians still argue about: whether the widespread practice of masters beating apprentices was primarily disciplinary or if it served some deeper cultural function about toughening boys into men. Guild records from places like Nuremberg and Venice are filled with incident reports. An apprentice lost an eye when a master threw a hammer at him for dropping a chisel. Another had his hand deliberately held against a hot forge for stealing a piece of bread. A third was beaten so severely for talking back that he couldn't work for a week. And these are just the incidents serious enough to warrant official documentation. Most beatings never made it into any record because they were considered normal, unremarkable parts of education. The food situation would leave you in a state of constant, gnawing hunger. You eat what the master's household eats, but you get the worst portions and you eat last. Breakfast, as we've covered, is bread and ale. Lunch, the main meal, usually around noon, might include pottage, which is a thick stew that sounds better than it is. Medieval pottage was whatever vegetables were cheap or available, boiled into submission with maybe some scraps of meat if you're lucky, seasoned with salt if the master isn't too cheap, and served in a trench-era hollowed-out piece of stale bread that serves as your bowl and then becomes part of the meal when it's soggy with stew. You don't get utensils beyond maybe a spoon that everyone shares. You eat with your hands, and you eat fast because if you don't, the other apprentices will take your portion. The hierarchy is rigid. Masters eat first and best, journeymen second, senior apprentices third, and you, the newest apprentice, get whatever's left, which is usually the watery dregs at the bottom of the pot and the vegetables so overboiled they've lost all nutritional value. Dinner is often just more bread, maybe some cheese, maybe some dried fish if you're in a coastal town. The monotony is soul-crushing. You eat the same foods in the same order week after week, month after month, year after year. Variety is for the wealthy. Your diet is designed purely for caloric efficiency enough to keep you working, not enough to make you comfortable. Malnutrition is universal among apprentices. You can see it in the skeletal remains archaeologists have excavated from medieval sites. Apprentice-age individuals show signs of stunted growth, bone deformities from vitamin deficiencies, dental disasters from lack of proper nutrition. Your body is developing during these apprenticeship years, but it's developing wrong, shaped by inadequate food and excessive labor into something that will hurt for the rest of your life. The clothing situation is equally grim. You own 2 sets of clothes, the ones you're wearing and the ones being scraped clean of filth. Medieval apprentice clothing was uniformly brown or gray-undied wool because dyes cost money and cut for function, not comfort. Your tunic hangs to about knee length, made of wool so coarse it feels like wearing a carpet. Underneath, you might have a linen shirt if you're fortunate, but linen was actually somewhat expensive, so many apprentices went without, wearing the wool directly against their skin. If you've never experienced wool directly on skin during physical labor, count yourself lucky. It itches, chafes. It absorbs sweat and then holds that moisture against your body until you're simultaneously damp and overheated. In winter, you're cold because one layer of wool isn't enough. In summer, you're dying because one layer of wool is too much, but you can't work. Shirtless modesty laws and guild regulations forbid it. You're shush if you have the mare leather turn shoes, basically soft leather wrapped around your feet and tied with laces. They wear out quickly, especially in workshop environments where you're standing on stone floors all day, sometimes near heat sources that dry the leather into brittle fragments. Many apprentices simply went barefoot for much of the year because shoes were expensive and masters weren't obligated to provide them beyond 1 pair per year. Imagine working in a blacksmith's forge barefoot, hopping around hot coals and metal scraps. Imagine a carpenter's workshop where wood splinters are everywhere, just waiting to jam deep into your heel. Foot injuries were incredibly common and often became infected because, again, no concept of germ theory and no effective treatments for infection beyond hoping your body fought it off on its own. The absolute worst part of apprentice life, worse than the hunger and the beatings and the exhaustion, is the complete lack of autonomy. You cannot leave the workshop without permission. You cannot visit your family without the master's approval, which was often granted once a year at most. You cannot pursue friendships outside the workshop because your entire existence is confined to this building and whatever errands your master sends you on. The isolation is psychologically devastating. You're surrounded by people all day, other apprentices, journeymen, customers, but you can't form real connections because everyone is either a competitor for the master's favor or someone with power over you. Trust is dangerous. Friendship is risky, so you retreat into yourself, become hard and closed off, and focus purely on survival. Letters home are impossible for most apprentices because you probably can't write. Literacy was not a given, even for craftspeople. Some trades required basic reading for measurements or contracts, but many didn't. Your parents, who might also be illiterate, can't write to you either, so you're just gone. Removed from your family at age 7 or 10 or 12, and the next time you see them for any meaningful duration, you're a young adult, changed by years of hardship into someone they barely recognize. Historians have found heartbreaking evidence in personal diaries and letters from parents expressing grief over their children's apprenticeships, describing it in terms similar to death, a necessary loss for the child's future, but a loss nonetheless. The psychological manipulation is sophisticated for a supposedly simple time. Masters used a calculated mix of punishment and occasional small rewards to keep apprentices compliant. You might endure 6 months of relentless criticism and physical discipline. Then suddenly the master praises you in front of a customer. That tiny moment of approval hits like a drug because you're so starved for any positive recognition. You'll work twice as hard for the next month chasing that feeling, even though the beatings continue. It's textbook conditioning, and it was devastatingly effective. Apprentices became emotionally dependent on their master's approval, which made them easier to control and less likely to run away or complain to guild authorities. Running away was technically an option, but the consequences were catastrophic. Guilds had networks across entire regions. A runaway apprentice from Paris would be recognized in Lyon, reported, and returned. The punishment for running away usually involved public humiliation. You might be whipped in the town square, followed by an extension of your apprenticeship term. That's right. Try to escape your 7-year sentence and you might find it's now 8 years or 9. Some guilds imposed fines on the parents of runaways, ensuring that your family would hate you for trying to escape your misery. The whole system was designed with escape prevention in mind because apprentices represented significant investment. Masters had paid guild fees for the right to take you on, had committed to housing and feeding you, and expected a return on that investment in the form of your labor. Losing an apprentice meant financial loss, so the system made sure it rarely happened. The other apprentices are not your friends, they're your competition and often your tormentors. The workshop hierarchy among apprentices is vicious. Senior apprentices, those who've survived several years and are approaching journeyman status, lord their experience over newcomers with sadistic glee. They'll give you wrong instructions, then laugh when the master beats you for following them. They'll hide tools you need, then watch you panic searching for them while the master screams about wasted time. They'll trip you when you're carrying hot materials or fragile work, causing disasters that get blamed on your clumsiness. This isn't bullying in the modern sense, it's a systematic hazing designed to reinforce the hierarchy and, in a twisted way, prepare you for the cutthroat world of medieval commerce. If you can't handle hostile apprentices, how will you handle hostile competitors when you're finally a master yourself? Sleep, when you finally get it, is frequently interrupted. The workshop never truly stops. If the master gets a rush order, everyone works through the night. If there's a fire risk, and there always is in buildings full of flammable materials and open flames, someone has to keep watch, usually rotating among apprentices. If a customer arrives at odd hours, apprentices are roused to assist. Your sleep is fragmented, never truly restful, because you're always partially alert for the next crisis or command. Modern sleep science has shown that this kind of interrupted sleep pattern causes serious cognitive and physical health problems. Medieval apprentices didn't know the science, but they lived the reality. Constant exhaustion, difficulty concentrating, weakened immune systems, and the kind of bone-deep tiredness that no amount of sleep ever fully resolves. The lack of privacy extends to every bodily function. You wash when you wash, which isn't often in full view of everyone else. Usually this happens once a week if you're lucky, in cold water from a communal bucket, using a rag that's been used by everyone before you. Soap exists, but it's expensive and harsh, made from lye and animal fats, and it's not wasted on apprentices. You basically just rinse the visible dirt off and call it done. Changing clothes happens in the same communal space. There's no shame about nudity exactly, but there's also no consideration for modesty or comfort. Bodies are just bodies, tools that do work, And nobody cares if you're embarrassed or uncomfortable about changing in front of others. Illness is perhaps the most terrifying aspect of apprentice life. If you get sick, you're useless, and useless apprentices are a burden. Minor illnesses, colds, stomach bugs, fevers are worked through because stopping means falling behind, and falling behind means punishment. Major illnesses are a disaster. There's no sick leave, no medical care beyond maybe some herbs boiled into a tea that probably does nothing, and no sympathy. If you're too sick to work for more than a few days, the master starts calculating whether you're worth keeping. Some contracts included clauses allowing masters to send severely ill apprentices back to their families, essentially dumping medical costs onto parents who can't afford them. Others specified that extended illness could void the apprenticeship with no refund. So you work through fevers that make you delirious, through injuries that should be resting, through infections that turn minor cuts into serious medical emergencies. The psychological impact of living like this for 7 years cannot be overstated. Modern studies of people in similarly controlled environments, prisoners, cult members, severely abused children, show patterns of learned helplessness, emotional numbing, and difficulty forming healthy relationships later in life. Medieval apprentices exhibited all of these. The letters and diaries that survive from former apprentices who later became literate often described their apprenticeship years with a kind of detached numbness, as if those experiences happened to someone else. The trauma was so normalized that many didn't even recognize it as trauma. It was just life, just what boys went through to become men and masters of a trade. And yet, the system perpetuated because it worked, economically at least. Apprentices were free labor that eventually became skilled labor, which became the next generation of masters who would take on their own apprentices. The cycle continued for centuries because no one with power had incentive to change it. Masters benefited from cheap labor, guilds benefited from controlled knowledge transfer. Parents saw it as the only path to a better life for their children than subsistence farming. The apprentices themselves, once they survived to become masters, perpetuated the same abuses they'd endured because that's how it was done, and because some part of them believed they'd earned the right to inflict the same suffering they'd survived. You lie on your straw pallet at night, if you can call it night when you'll be woken before dawn, listening to the other apprentices breathe and snore and occasionally cry quietly when they think no one's listening. Your body aches in places you didn't know could ache. Your hands are damaged in ways that won't fully heal. Your stomach growls despite the pottage at dinner. And you know, with absolute certainty, that tomorrow will be exactly the same, and the day after, and the day after that, stretching forward for 7 interminable years. This is your life now. This is the price of learning a trade, of maybe one day having a shop of your own, of escaping the grinding poverty of peasant life. The question that haunts you as you drift into exhausted sleep is whether the price is worth paying, or whether you're just trading one form of misery for another. The tools surrounding you in this medieval workshop aren't just primitive theory actively hostile to human survival. Every single implement you'll touch today was designed in an era that viewed injury as an inevitable cost of production rather than something to prevent. There are no safety guards, no emergency shutoffs, no OSHA regulations, no liability concerns. There's just sharp metal, extreme heat, crushing weights, and the cheerful medieval assumption that if you're stupid enough to hurt yourself, that's your problem. Let's start with the most obvious danger, the forge. If you're unlucky enough to be a blacksmith's apprentice, your workday revolves around a stone hearth filled with burning coal that reaches temperatures exceeding 300 degrees Fahrenheit. That's hot enough to melt iron, which means it's certainly hot enough to melt you. The forge has no protective barriers, no heat shields, no temperature warnings. It's just there, glowing orange and red, radiating heat that makes the air shimmer and your eyeballs feel like they're drying out in their sockets. You work inches away from this inferno, holding metal pieces with tongs that are essentially just two pieces of metal hinged together. These tongs don't lock if your grip loosens for even a second. Whatever you're holding drops, either back into the forge, sending up a shower of sparks and coal dust, or onto the floor where it might land on your foot, through your leather shoe, and into your flesh. The hammer you're swinging is a 3-pound block of iron on a wooden handle that's been used by so many apprentices before you that the wood is smooth and dark from absorbed sweat and hand oils. This handle has stress fractures you can't see, weaknesses in the grain from years of repeated impact. At any moment, mid-swing, could split or break, sending the hammer head flying. Maybe it flies into the forge, maybe into a wall, maybe into another person's skull. Medieval workshop accident records from guild investigations include dozens of cases where flying hammerheads caused serious injuries or deaths. And here's the thing: there's no standardization. Every hammer is slightly different, weighted differently, balanced differently. You have to learn the personality of each tool through use, which means through mistakes, which means through injuries. The anvil itself is basically a 150-pound chunk of iron sitting on a tree stump. It's solid and stable until it's not. If the wooden base rots sand, it will. Given the damp conditions in most workshops, the whole thing can shift or topple during use. Imagine bringing a hammer down with full force, expecting to hit your workpiece. But the anvil moves at the last microsecond. Your hammer glances off, the metal you're shaping goes flying, and your hand, continuing its downward trajectory, slams into the edge of the anvil with enough force to shatter bones. This happened frequently. Archaeological evidence from medieval skeletal remains shows that blacksmiths had an incredibly high incidence of hand and wrist fractures, many of which healed poorly because you couldn't stop working long enough for proper healing. Now let's talk about the tools that cut. If you're in a carpenter's workshop or a cooper's shop making barrels, you're surrounded by blades. Hand saws with teeth like shark jaws, chisels sharp enough to shave with, draw knives that you pull toward your own body with both hands, using your chest as a brace. That drawknife detail is worth sitting with for a momentary, literally pulling a razor-sharp blade toward your vital organs with significant force, trusting that you'll stop it before it reaches you. The technique requires you to lean back, using your body weight as resistance. If the wood grain catches unexpectedly and releases suddenly, that blade continues its path, often into your abdomen or chest. Guild records from the Worshipful Company of Carpenters in London document 17 deaths from drawknife accidents in just a 30-year period in the 15th century. And those are only the ones serious enough to investigate. Chisels are handed to you sharp, extremely sharp, because dull tools require more force and are actually more dangerous. But a sharp chisel, combined with the medieval technique of often holding your workpiece in one hand while working it with the other, means you're essentially playing a daily game of, how close can I get this blade to my fingers without cutting them off? The answer, eventually, is not close enough. Almost every experienced woodworker from medieval artwork and written descriptions is shown missing finger segments. It wasn't a matter of if you'd lose a piece of a finger, but when and how many pieces you'd lose over a career. Some historians estimate that up to 70% of master carpenters had visible finger mutilations by age 40. The foot-powered lathe deserves its own special mention in the Hall of Medieval Death Traps. This device consists of a horizontal spindle that holds your workpiece, powered by a rope wrapped around it that connects to a foot pedal. You pump the pedal, the rope turns the spindle, and you hold a sharp chisel against the spinning wood to shape it. Sounds simple, right? Except the spindle has no speed control. It spins as fast as you can pump your foot. And when you're trying to keep up with production demands, you pump fast. The wood is spinning at speeds that turn it into a blur, and you're pressing sharp metal against it. If the chisel catches wrong, the workpiece can shatter, sending wooden shrapnel flying at velocities that can embed splinters inches deep into your flesh. Or the chisel itself can be ripped from your hands, becoming a spinning blade attached to nothing, flying through the workshop like a medieval helicopter blade. Historians still argue whether the high injury rates in medieval workshops were simply accepted as inevitable or if there were informal safety practices that just didn't make it into written records. The evidence suggests mostly the former, that injury was so common it wasn't even worth commenting on unless it resulted in death or complete disability. A sliced finger, a minor burn, a wooden splinter through your palm, these weren't events. They were Tuesday. Let's move to textile workshops, which sounds safer until you understand the equipment. A weaving loom is a massive wooden frame with hundreds of threads under tension. These threads, especially when made from linen or hemp, can be incredibly strong enough that if one snaps under tension, it whips through the air like a razor wire. Weavers regularly suffered eye injuries from snapped threads, including complete loss of vision. The shuttle, a wooden boat-shaped device you throw back and forth through the threads, weighs about a pound and moves fast. In a wide loom, you're essentially throwing a wooden club across a 6-foot span dozens of times per minute. Miss the catch, and it hits whoever's on the other side, often another apprentice. Workshop records mention broken noses, shattered teeth, and concussions from shuttle accidents so frequently that some guilds developed specific compensation schedules. You get 3 days off for a broken nose, a week for missing teeth, that kind of thing. The spinning wheel, which seems gentle and domestic, will absolutely destroy your hands. The drive wheel is large and wooden, powered by a foot pedal, connected by a belt to a smaller spindle wheel that spins at a much higher speed. If you're carding wool, preparing the fibers for spinningerie, working with wool that still contains debris, small twigs, seeds, occasionally thorns from the bushes sheep rubbed against. These get embedded in your fingers as you work. The spinning process itself requires you to feed wool fibers into a rapidly spinning hook. Get your finger too close, and the wheel grabs it, wrapping your flesh around the spindle before you can react. The torque is enough to deglove a finger, literally strip the skin off like removing a glove. This injury appears in enough medieval medical texts that physicians had a standard treatment for it, which tells you everything about how common it was. Dye workshops present a completely different category of danger. The vats are enormous, sometimes large enough to stand an and filled with near-boiling liquid mixed with chemicals that would make a modern safety inspector weep. To dye cloth, you're reaching into these vats with wooden paddles or, for smaller pieces, with your bare hands protected only by the calluses you've developed. The steam alone is scalding. Slip on the perpetually wet floor, and you fall into a vat of boiling dye. This happened often enough that most dye workshops were designed with the vats slightly recessed into the floor, not for safety but so that the workers could reach into them more easily, which just made the falling in problem worse because now you're falling into a hole filled with boiling chemicals. Leatherworking tools are their own nightmare. The curved knives used for skiving thinning leather edges are sharp enough to cut through thick hide with minimal pressure, which means they'll go through your finger like butter. The awls used for punching holes are basically ice picks. You're driving these through tough leather by hitting them with a mallet. And if you miss, you're driving an ice pick into your hand or thigh. The Bema rounded wooden bench that you drape leather over while scraping, it requires you to work a sharp blade toward yourself with both hands, often while standing in a position that means any slip results in the blade going into your stomach or groin. Here's a quirky detail that most people don't know. Medieval workshops often repaired broken tools by essentially jury-rigging them back together. A cracked hammer handle would be wrapped with leather strips or cord and put back into service. A chipped chisel would be reground into a different shape and used until it was too short to hold safely. Saw blades would be sharpened so many times that the teeth became irregular and unpredictable. This culture of make-do repair meant that tools became increasingly dangerous over their lifespan. But throwing away a damaged tool meant buying or making a new one, and that cost money. So you used damaged, unreliable tools and just hoped they didn't fail catastrophically. The pottery workshop, if you're unfortunate enough to end up in one, features a whole wheel, literally a stone disc weighing 50 to 100 pounds that you kick to make it spin. Get your hand caught between the wheel and the support post, and you're losing fingers. The wet clay, while not dangerous itself, makes everything slippery. Tools slip, feet slip, and the kick will keep spinning with momentum that can't be stopped quickly. Plus, there's the kiln, massive oven that reaches temperatures over 2,000 degrees and has to be loaded and unloaded by hand using wooden paddles. The heat radiating from an open kiln door can give you second-degree burns on your face and arms from 6 feet away. Loading pottery into the kiln means reaching into that heat repeatedly, and your depth perception gets thrown off by the shimmering air and intense brightness. You will touch the kiln walls. You will drop pieces that shatter and send sharp ceramic shards flying. You will burn yourself so many times that your forearms become a map of scars. Even the seemingly simple tools are dangerous in medieval context. A needle used for leatherwork or heavy textile sewing is thick and sharp, driven through material with a pompata leather disc you wear on your palm to push needles through. These needles break, often when they're halfway through the material, and the back half, released under tension, flies like a tiny spear. They embed in hands, arms, faces, sometimes deep enough to require a barber surgeon to remove them, assuming you can afford one. More often, you dig it out yourself with a knife, creating a new wound to deal with the first one. The work environment itself makes every tool more dangerous. Lighting is terrible, either dim daylight through small windows or expensive candlelight that flickers and creates moving shadows. You're making precise cuts and measurements in lighting conditions that would be illegal in any modern workplace. The floors are uneven stone or packed earth, often wet from quenching water, spilled dye, or just general moisture. Your footing is always uncertain. The air is full of particles, metal dust in a blacksmith's shop, wood dust in a carpenter's workshop, fiber dust in a textile mill that get in your eyes, making them water and blur just when you need clear vision. Temperature extremes make tool handling even more treacherous. In winter, your hands are numb with cold, making it hard to grip properly. In summer, they're slippery with sweat. The wooden handles of tools swell and shrink with humidity changes, making their fit in your hands unpredictable. Metal tools left near heat sources become burning hot. Metal tools in cold workshops become painfully cold to hold. There's no such thing as ergonomics. Tools are designed purely for function. with no consideration for the human holding them. Handles are often too thick or too thin for comfortable grip, too long or too short for proper leverage, shaped in ways that create pressure points and blisters. The truly insidious danger is cumulative damage. Each day, you're exposed to a dozen small injuries, minor cuts, light burns, small bruises, repetitive strain. Individually, none are serious. Collectively, over months and years, they create chronic conditions that modern medicine has names for: carpal tunnel syndrome, tennis elbow, chronic regional pain syndrome. Medieval people just called it the ache or workshop hands and considered it normal. Your hands gradually transform from functioning tools into painful, damaged appendages that nonetheless must keep working because there's no disability insurance, no workers' compensation, no retirement plan. You work until your hands literally cannot hold tools anymore, and then you're done, cast aside as too broken to be useful. Standing here in your workshop, surrounded by these instruments of gradual dismemberment, you realize that the job isn't to avoid injury. That's impossible. The job is to manage injury, to keep the damage within acceptable bounds, whatever acceptable means in a world where a severed finger is just the cost of learning your trade. You look at your hands, still mostly intact because you're new to this, and you know with absolute certainty that they won't stay that way. The only question is how much of them you'll have left after 7 years. Take a deep breath. No, actually, don't, because the air in this medieval workshop is essentially a slow-acting poison that's going to shorten your life with every inhale. Modern people think of air pollution as a recent problem, all smog and car exhaust and factory emissions. But medieval workshops achieved levels of atmospheric toxicity that would require hazmat suits today. And you're standing in it for 16 hours a day with nothing but your increasingly damaged lungs as filtration. Let's start with the blacksmith's forge. Since we've already established you're probably going to lose fingers there, you might as well understand what's happening to your respiratory system at the same time. Coal smoke is the baseline horror. Medieval forges burned either charcoal or coal, and both produce carbon monoxide, colorless, odorless gas that binds to your blood cells better than oxygen does, essentially suffocating you at the cellular level. But you can't tell it's happening. There's no immediate choking sensation, no dramatic collapse, just a persistent headache, fatigue beyond what even the work explains, occasional dizziness, and a feeling like your brain is wrapped in wool. That's chronic low-level carbon monoxide poisoning. And every blacksmith, every apprentice, every person who worked near a forge experienced it daily. Historians examining skeletal remains of medieval metalworkers have found evidence of chronic hypoxia-oxygen deprivation in bone density patterns and skull thickness changes that suggest their bodies were constantly trying to compensate for inadequate oxygen. But carbon monoxide is just the opening act. When you're forging iron, you're heating metal to temperatures where it begins to release particles into the air, iron oxide dust, various metal fumes depending on what alloys you're working with. These microscopic particles float in the superheated air around the forge, and you breathe them in. They settle in your lungs, in the delicate alveoli where oxygen exchange happens, and they stay there. Your body can't break them down or expel them effectively. Over months and years, your lungs become progressively stiffer, less efficient, slowly filling with metal dust like a room filling with snow. Modern autopsies of historical metalworkers remains show lungs that are literally discolored gray or black instead of healthy pink from accumulated particulate matter. The sulfur is what you can smell, though. Coal contains sulfur compounds, and when burned, They produce sulfur dioxide that's sharp, acrid smell that makes your nose burn and your eyes water. In high concentrations, it's immediately painful. In the chronic low concentrations of a medieval workshop, it's just constantly irritating. Your throat is always raw, your nose always running or stuffed up, your eyes perpetually inflamed. Sulfur dioxide also reacts with moisture to form sulfuric acid, which means the inside of your respiratory tract is being mildly acid-washed every time you breathe. The chronic cough that every metalworker develops isn't just from smoky, it's your lungs trying desperately to expel the corrosive atmosphere you're forcing through them. Move over to a tanning workshop, and you've entered a whole different circle of atmospheric hell. Tanning leather requires removing hair and flesh from animal hides, then treating them with chemicals to prevent decay. The chemicals in question are spectacularly nasty. Lime calcium oxide was commonly used for dehairing. It's a caustic base that burns skin on contact and, when dry, produces a fine dust that floats through the air like malevolent flour. Breathe it in, and it reacts with the moisture in your lungs to produce more calcium hydroxide, essentially burning your respiratory tract from the inside. Tanners were known for their chronic respiratory problems, persistent coughs that produced bloody phlegm, and voices that became progressively raspier until some could barely speak above a whisper. But lime is almost pleasant compared to the other tanning agents. Many workshops used dog feces, bird droppings, or urinal rich in ammoniato treat hides. These would be mixed into vats where hides soaked for days or weeks. The ammonia fumes alone are chokinga sharp, eye-watering assault that makes breathing feel like inhaling knives. Chronic ammonia exposure causes chemical burns in your respiratory tract, permanent damage to your sense of smell, and a condition medieval people called tanner's lung, which is probably what we'd now recognize as chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Tanners had some of the shortest life expectancies of any medieval profession, and the atmospheric conditions are a big reason why. Here's something historians still debate: whether medieval people recognized the connection between workshop air quality and health problems, or whether they just accepted chronic respiratory disease as an inevitable part of certain professions. Some guild regulations mention requiring adequate ventilation windows that could open, doors on opposite walls to create cross-breeze, but enforcement was spotty at best. And many workshops were in cramped urban buildings where proper ventilation was architecturally impossible. The evidence suggests most people understood that certain trades weakened the lungs, but had no real framework for understanding why or how to prevent it. Textile workshops present a more insidious danger because the air seems cleaner, no visible smoke, no chemical smells that burn your nose. But the fiber dust is relentless. Wool, linen, hemp, all of them shed microscopic fibers as they're worked. These fibers float through the air in concentrations that turn the sunbeams streaming through windows into visible shafts of particulate matter. You're breathing in thousands of these fibers every hour. They lodge in your lungs, irritate the delicate tissues, and trigger your body's immune response. Over time, this constant inflammation causes scarring pulmonary fibrosis, though medieval people just called it spinner's consumption. Your lungs gradually become less elastic, less able to expand fully, until even simple tasks leave you gasping for air. The dye workshops are their own chemical nightmare. Natural dyes required mordants chemicals that helped the dye bond to fabric, and these were often highly toxic. Alum was common and relatively safe, but many dyers used copper salts, iron salts, or even arsenic compounds to achieve certain colors. These chemicals don't just stay in the dye vats, they evaporate into the air, especially when the vats are heated to near boiling. You're breathing in metal vapors that accumulate in your body tissues. Copper exposure causes a metallic taste in your mouth, neurological symptoms, and eventually organ damage. Arsenic, even in small chronic doses, causes skin lesions, peripheral neuropathy, and various cancers. Medieval dyers had characteristic health problems: skin discoloration, tremors, digestive issues that we can now recognize as heavy metal poisoning, but they had no idea what was causing it. The organic dyes themselves could be problematic. Woadest for blue diaferments during processing, producing ammonia and other volatile compounds. Madder root for red dye releases dust during the grinding process that's mildly toxic and causes skin irritation and respiratory problems. Indigo dyeing involves a fermentation process that produces hydrogen sulfide, the rotten egg smell, which in high enough concentrations is deadly, and in chronic low concentrations causes headaches, nausea, and respiratory irritation. You can always identify a dye worker by their chronic cough and the faint chemical smell that clings to them even after bathing. Wood workshops seem safer because wood is natural, right? Except different woods release different chemicals when cut. Yew wood, commonly used for bows and fine furniture, contains taxine alkaloids that become airborne as sawdust. Chronic exposure causes dizziness, nausea, and cardiac problems. Oak sawdust, probably the most common, is now recognized as a carcinogen specifically linked to nasal and sinus cancers. Exotic woods imported for luxury goods could be even worse. Ebony dust causes severe skin and respiratory irritation. Rosewood contains sensitizing compounds that can trigger allergic reactions severe enough to close your throat. And you're breathing all of this constantly because medieval saws are hand-powered, which means slow, which means lots of time for sawdust to accumulate in the air. The wood finishes are another layer of toxicity. Linseed oil, heated for quick-drying varnishes, produces acrylena chemical so irritating that modern safety regulations require respirators when using it. Medieval woodworkers just breathed it in, dealing with the tearing eyes and burning throat as part of the job. Some finishes included lead compounds for durability and appearance. You're applying these with rags, in a poorly ventilated workshop, breathing in lead vapor that's accumulating in your bones and brain, slowly causing the cognitive decline, mood changes, and physical symptoms that medieval people attributed to age but we'd recognize as lead poisoning. Pottery workshops have the clay dust, which seems innocent until you understand that medieval clay often contained crystalline silica, the same stuff that causes silicosis in modern miners and stone workers. This dust is particularly insidious because the particles are the perfect size to reach deep into your lungs but too large for your body to clear effectively. They lodge in the alveoli and cause progressive scarring. Silicosis is irreversible and inevitably progresses to respiratory failure. Potters developed this condition so reliably that it was recognized as occupational, though of course nothing was done about it beyond acknowledging that potters didn't live long. The kiln smoke adds another dimension. Wood-fired kilns, the most common type, produce all the usual wood smoke pollutants: carbon monoxide, particulate matter, volatile organic compounds. But ceramic glazes, especially those containing lead or other metals for color and finish, release metal vapors when fired. You're standing near an open kiln, breathing in lead vapor, copper vapor, whatever else is in the glaze, while simultaneously being exposed to extreme heat that makes you breathe harder and faster, pulling more contaminated air into your lungs. Even the seemingly simple act of heating your workspace in winter becomes an atmospheric hazard. Most workshops used brazier metal containers filled with burning charcoal or coal, placed directly in the work area with no chimney or ventilation. The carbon monoxide from these heaters, in an enclosed space, could reach lethal levels. Winter was when you'd find apprentices who didn't wake up in the morning, dead from carbon monoxide poisoning in their sleep. This happened often enough that some guilds had specific regulations about cracking windows even in cold weather, though of course this made the heating ineffective. So many workshops ignored the rules and just accepted the occasional death as the price of staying warm. The cumulative effect of all these atmospheric hazards is that your respiratory system is under constant assault. Your nose, throat, and lungs are perpetually inflamed. Your body's natural defense mechanisms, mucus production, coughing, sneezing are in constant overdrive and eventually become less effective. Chronic inflammation leads to scarring. Scarring leads to reduced lung capacity. Reduced lung capacity means you can't work as hard, which means you're less valuable, which means you're more likely to be dismissed or pushed into even worse working conditions. It's a death spiral, literally. The quirky reality that most people don't know is that medieval people did attempt some forms of respiratory protection, just hilariously ineffective ones. Some metal workers would tie cloth over their nose and mouth, thinking it filtered the air. It didn't. The particles and gases passed right through. Some tanners would chew herbs or hold aromatic materials near their face, believing pleasant smells counteracted harmful ones. This was based on miasma theory, the idea that bad smells themselves caused disease, so they thought masking the smell solved the problem. Didn't. Some dyers would drink milk, believing it coated the lungs and protected them. It didn't, though it might have provided some calcium to partially mitigate heavy metal absorption. The long-term health outcomes are grim. Medieval people who worked in these environments for decades, if they survived that long, developed what we'd now diagnose as chronic bronchitis, emphysema, pulmonary fibrosis, various cancers, and heavy metal toxicity. But they had no framework for understanding these as connected to their work environment. They just knew that old craftsmen couldn't breathe well, coughed constantly, and often died gasping for air. It was considered normal aging for their profession. The idea that work environments could be modified to prevent this never gained traction because the economic incentive was all wrong. Healthier workers might live longer, but that didn't increase immediate productivity. And immediate productivity was all that mattered. You're standing in this toxic soup right now, feeling your throat get scratchy, your eyes starting to burn, maybe developing the first tickle of what will become a chronic cough. Every breath is damaging you in ways you can't see and won't fully understand for years. The master is yelling at you to stop standing around and get back to work, which means moving closer to the forge, or the tanning vat, or the dye pot, or whatever source of atmospheric poison defines your particular workshop hell. You take another breath because you have to, because humans need oxygen even when that oxygen comes packaged with a dozen different toxins. And you'll take another breath, and another, thousands per day, millions over 7 years, each one depositing a tiny amount of damage that accumulates into the chronic diseases that will define your shortened life. The air you're breathing right now is killing you slowly, and there's absolutely nothing you can do about it except breathe. You might think the worst part of medieval workshop life is the physical suffering, the injuries, the exhaustion, the toxic air slowly filling your lungs with poison. But there's an entire layer of institutional control that makes all of that worse. The guild system. These weren't friendly professional associations or networking groups. Medieval guilds were economic cartels that controlled every aspect of your professional existence, with rules enforced through fines, physical punishment, public humiliation, and complete destruction of your livelihood if you stepped out of line. The guild controls your life before you even enter the workshop. Remember that apprenticeship contract your parents signed? The guild approved it. They set the terms, the length, the fees. Your parents paid the master for taking you on. But they also paid the guild an enrollment fee, sometimes as much as a year's wages for a skilled laborer. This fee wasn't optional, and it wasn't refundable if you failed, quit, or died during your apprenticeship. The guild kept that money regardless. In some trades, particularly prestigious ones like goldsmithing or certain types of specialized weaving, the guild also required proof of legitimate birth. If your parents weren't married in the eyes of the church, you couldn't join, no matter how talented you were or how much money your family had. The guild's power to exclude was absolute. Once you're in, the guild determines what you can learn and when. Masters weren't free to teach whatever they wanted. Guild regulations specified which techniques could be taught to apprentices, which were reserved for journeymen, and which were secrets that only masters could know. This wasn't about maintaining quality standards. It was about controlling knowledge to limit competition. A master goldsmith might know 15 different alloy formulations, but the guild rules permitted him to teach an apprentice only 3. The rest you'd have to learn after completing your apprenticeship and paying additional fees to access higher-level guild instruction. It's like going to medical school but being forbidden from learning about certain organs until you pay extra tuition years later. The guild determines when your workday starts and ends. Those bells we talked about in Section 1? Guild bells, rung according to guild-mandated schedules. Work before the morning bell, and you're violating guild regulations. You might be trying to get ahead of competitors through extra hours, which is unfair. Work after the evening bell, and you're also in violation. You might be doing poor quality work in inadequate light, which damages the guild's reputation. The penalties for these violations started with fines and escalated to having your work confiscated, being banned from taking new commissions, or even expulsion from the guild, which meant you couldn't legally practice your trade anywhere in the region. Here's something historians still argue about: whether guild regulations about work hours were genuinely concerned with quality control or were primarily about limiting production to keep prices high. The evidence suggests mostly the latter. Guilds in the same city, working with similar materials and techniques, had wildly different rules about hours, which makes no sense if the rules were about safety or quality. But it makes perfect sense if each guild was trying to find the sweet spot between production volume and price maximization. They were medieval OPEC, basically controlling supply to maintain profit margins. The guild controls what tools you can use. In many trades, certain advanced tools or techniques were restricted to masters only. Journeymen and apprentices had to use older, harder, more dangerous methods because the efficient tools were guild secrets. A master weaver might have a specialized shuttle design that made certain patterns easier to produce, but guild rules forbade him from letting apprentices use it. You had to do it the hard way, the slow way, the way that destroyed your hands and took 3 times as long. Once you became a master yourself after paying substantial fees, of course you could access these secret tools. This wasn't about maintaining standards. It was about making sure that masters maintained their productivity advantage over non-masters. Quality control was enforced through guild inspectors who could show up at any time, unannounced, to examine your work and materials. These inspectors, usually senior masters elected by the guild, had the authority to confiscate any work they deemed substandard and fine you for the materials and labor wasted on it. The standards were often deliberately vague, which gave inspectors enormous discretionary power. Don't like someone? Find a reason to declare their work inadequate. Want to help out a friend or relative? Overlook obvious defects. The system was ripe for corruption, and corruption flourished. Some guilds even had unofficial inspection insurance, regular payments to inspectors to ensure they were lenient during official visits. The guild controlled pricing in ways that would make modern antitrust lawyers weep. Minimum prices were set for common goods to prevent destructive competition. You couldn't undercut a competitor even if you wanted to, even if you could afford to, even if it would get you more customers. Sell a horseshoe for less than the guild-mandated price, and you'd be fined more than you saved. Maximum prices were also sometimes set for materials, supposedly to prevent price gouging, but actually to ensure that suppliers couldn't charge master craftsmen too much. The guild represented the master's interests, and these price controls were designed to maximize master profits while limiting what apprentices and journeymen could eventually earn when they set up their own shops. Marketing and advertising were strictly controlled. In most guilds, you couldn't actively solicit customers, they had to come to you. No calling out to passers-by. No sending apprentices to drum up business. No signs or advertisements beyond the standard guild symbol that every workshop in your trade displayed. Some guilds even prohibited workshops from being visible from the street, requiring them to be in courtyards or upper floors, accessible only to people who already knew where to find them. The theory was that quality work would attract customers through reputation alone. The reality was that this system favored established masters with existing customer bases and made it nearly impossible for new masters to break in. The guild determined who you could work for and who could work for you. Poaching was strictly forbidden. If an apprentice or journeyman was contracted to one master, no other master in the guild could employ them until the contract was fulfilled or formally dissolved. This sounds reasonable until you realize it meant that if your master was abusive, or incompetent, or going bankrupt, you were stuck. You couldn't leave for a better situation. The guild sided with masters in almost every dispute because the guild leadership was composed of masters. The entire system was designed by masters, for masters, with apprentices and journeymen treated as resources to be controlled rather than people with rights. Your progression from apprentice to journeyman to master was entirely in the guild's hands. Completing your 7-year apprenticeship didn't automatically make you a journeyman. You had to apply to the guild, demonstrate your skills in a formal examination, and pay a fee. The examination standards were whatever the examining masters decided they were on that particular day. Too many journeymen in the trade already? Sorry, your work isn't quite good enough. Try again next year and pay the examination fee again. Know someone on the examination committee? Congratulations. Your mediocre work is deemed excellent. Welcome to journeyman status. The journeyman period itself was often just another form of exploitation. As a journeyman, you were technically a qualified craftsman, but you still couldn't set up your own workshop. You had to work for a master, now for wages rather than just room and board. But those wages were set by guild regulations at levels that made it nearly impossible to save enough money to eventually become a master yourself. The guild mandated wage rates that were high enough to keep journeymen from starving and low enough to keep them from accumulating the capital needed to become independent. It's a system designed to maintain a permanent underclass of skilled workers who could never rise to master status. Becoming a master required producing a masterpiece, a demonstration piece that proved you'd mastered the trade. This sounds fair and meritocratic until you understand the reality. First, you had to pay a substantial fee just for the right to attempt the masterpiece. Then you had to purchase materials at your own expense, materials whose quality was often specified by the guild at levels deliberately set to be expensive. Then you had to produce the piece under supervision, often in a limited time frame, while still maintaining your regular work to earn money. If you failed, you lost everything: the fees, the materials, the time. You could try again, but you had to pay all the fees again. Even if you produced an acceptable masterpiece, you still needed to pay the admission fee to become a master, often equivalent to several years' wages. Then you needed capital to set up your own workshop, tools, materials, rental space, money to live on while you built a customer base. The total cost of becoming a master was so high that most journeymen never made it. They remained journeymen for life, working for wages, never achieving independence. Some historians estimate that in major cities, only about 20 to 30% of apprentices who successfully completed their training ever became masters. The rest remained in a permanent state of skilled but subordinate labor. The guild also controlled your personal life in ways that seem absurd. Many guilds had rules about marriage. You couldn't marry without guild permission, and marrying someone the guild disapproved of could cost you your membership. Some guilds required that a master's widow marry another guild member if she wanted to keep the workshop running. Her choices were to marry a man the guild approved or lose her livelihood. Guilds regulated what you wore, where you lived, which taverns you could frequent, which churches you attended. The Goldsmiths Guild in Paris had rules about how elaborately members could dress, ostensibly to prevent ostentatious display, but really to maintain visible class distinctions between masters, journeymen, and apprentices. Guild politics were vicious. Leadership positions, guild masters, wardens, inspectors came with power and profit. These positions were technically elected by the membership, but in practice, they were controlled by a small oligarchy of wealthy masters who'd held power for years or decades. They used their positions to award contracts to themselves and their allies, to overlook regulations violations by friends while strictly enforcing them against rivals, to manipulate apprentice assignments so that talented boys went to their own workshops. Challenging this oligarchy was career suicide. Make an enemy of a guild leader, and suddenly your work is always failing inspections. Your journeymen are being poached. Your contracts are mysteriously canceled. Here's a quirky detail most people don't know. Some guilds had rules specifically designed to limit master mobility. If you became a master in London, your credentials weren't automatically recognized in Paris or Venice or anywhere else. Each city's guild operated independently, and they protected their local markets by making it difficult or impossible for foreign masters to practice. You might be a renowned goldsmith in Florence, but move to Cologne and you'd have to start over, possibly even going through another apprenticeship period because the Cologne Guild refused to recognize your Italian qualifications. This kept skills and knowledge fragmented across Europe and prevented any kind of universal professional standards. The Guild's enforcement mechanisms were harsh and public. Fines were the first line of punishment, but they escalated quickly. Repeated violations might result in confiscation of tools or materials, essentially destroying your ability to work. Serious violations could mean public humiliation. Being paraded through the market in your work apron while a herald proclaimed your offense, or being forced to stand in the pillory outside the guild hall while members threw refuse at you. The ultimate punishment was expulsion, being formally removed from the guild and forbidden from practicing your trade anywhere in the region. This was an economic death sentence. Without guild membership, you couldn't legally work. Any attempt to practice your trade would result in your work being destroyed, your tools confiscated, and possibly criminal charges for unlicensed commerce. The system was designed to be inescapable. The guild controlled access to materials through monopoly agreements with suppliers. You couldn't buy the raw materials for your trade without guild approval. The guild controlled access to markets through regulations about where and when you could sell. The guild controlled access to knowledge through restrictions on what could be taught and to whom. The guild controlled access to capital through their influence over who could borrow money for workshop setup. Every aspect of professional existence flowed through the guild, and the guild's primary concern was protecting the interests of the masterclass oligarchy that ran it. And yet people submitted to this system because the alternative was worse. Without a guild, you had no legal protection for your work, no recourse against customers who refused to pay, no access to the regulated markets where the money was. Independent craftsmen, those working outside guild structures, were relegated to the poorest customers, the worst materials, and constant threat of being shut down by guild enforcers who viewed unlicensed competition as theft. The guild might be oppressive, exploitative, and corrupt, but it was the only game in town. You're standing in this workshop, surrounded by tools you're not allowed to use efficiently, producing work you're not allowed to sell independently, learning skills you're not permitted to master fully, all while enriching a master who himself is constrained by guild regulations designed to benefit the small oligarchy at the top. Your labor, your suffering, your slowly accumulating injuries and illnesses, all of it flows upward through a system designed to extract maximum value from your body while providing minimum opportunity for advancement. The guild's iron fist is invisible most of the time, but it's always there, squeezing, controlling, ensuring that you stay exactly where the system wants you, productive, subordinate, and replaceable. The bell above the workshop door jingles, and your stomach drops. A customer has arrived, which means everything you're doing wrong is about to be noticed, criticized, and possibly used as justification for punishment. Medieval customers weren't the friendly, understanding folks who might leave a Yelp review if dissatisfied. They were a rotating cast of demanding nobles, suspicious merchants, haggling housewives, and church officials who viewed craftsmen as somewhere between servants and livestock, useful when they produced what was wanted, disposable when they didn't. Let's start with the nobility, because they're somehow the worst despite being the most profitable. A nobleman walks into the workshop and you'd better stop what you're doing immediately and bow, because failure to show proper deference is an insult that could get your master fined or the whole workshop in trouble. This person has come to commission something: armor, fine cloth, an ornate piece of furniture, whatever your trade produces at its highest level. They have exacting standards, unlimited confidence in their own taste, and absolutely no understanding of what's actually possible with medieval technology and materials. The nobleman wants a sword with a blade that never dulls, holds an edge through 100 battles, and also has an intricate inlay design that requires hammering gold wire into the steel. Never mind that these requirements are contradictory. The harder you make steel to hold an edge, the more brittle it becomes, making detailed inlay work likely to crack the blade. Never mind that the gold inlay will wear away after minimal use anyway. The customer wants it, expects it, and will be outraged if you try to explain the limitations. So your master smiles, nods, accepts the commission, and you, the apprentice, will spend weeks trying to achieve the impossible while being beaten for the inevitable failures. Noble women are their own particular nightmare, especially in textile workshops. She wants a dress in a specific shade of blue that she saw once, maybe in a painting, or perhaps she dreamed it. You're expected to reproduce this imaginary color exactly. The dyes available are limited wood for blue, madder for red, weld for yellow, and various combinations thereof. The exact shade depends on countless variables: the quality of the dye stuff, the mordant used, the temperature and duration of dyeing, the type of fabric. 2 batches are never identical, but she expects perfection, expects consistency, and when the fabric you produce doesn't match her vague memory of a color that may never have existed, she'll refuse payment and possibly demand compensation for her wasted time. Here's something historians still debate: whether medieval craftsmen deliberately cultivated relationships with difficult noble clients because their demands, while unreasonable, pushed technical innovation, or whether the nobility's impossible standards simply resulted in wasted materials and frustrated workers with nothing to show for it. The evidence is mixed. Some spectacular technical achievements can be traced to noble commissions, but for every success, there were dozens of failures that bankrupted workshops or broke craftsmen's spirits. Merchants are different creatures entirely. They're not interested in artistry or uniqueness. They want volume, consistency, and the lowest possible price. A cloth merchant arrives with a contract for 500 yards of wool fabric, all identical in weight, weave, and color, delivered in 6 weeks. Your workshop has 3 looms and 4 workers counting yourself. The math doesn't work. It's physically impossible to produce that quantity in that time frame at the quality specified. But the merchant knows this, knows you know this, and is deliberately offering an impossible contract to see how much you'll compromise on quality or deadline to meet the price point. Your master, desperate for the work because the workshop hasn't had a major contract in 2 months and there's rent to pay, accepts. Now you're working double shifts, 18, 20 hours a day producing fabric as fast as humanly possible. Quality suffers. The weave gets loose in places, tight in others. Color consistency is impossible when you're rushing through the dyeing process. But the merchant will inspect every yard, will find every flaw, and will use those flaws to negotiate the price down after the work is completed. You've already done the labor, used the materials, spent the time. The merchant knows you can't afford to refuse partial payment, so they offer 60% of the agreed price, citing the inferior quality that they knew would be inevitable given their impossible requirements. The church customers are perhaps the most anxiety-inducing because they come with moral authority in addition to economic power. A monastery needs new vestments, altar cloths, illuminated manuscripts if you're in that trade. The requirements are specific because they're dictated by religious law and tradition. The colors must be exact. Liturgical purple isn't just any purple. It's a specific shade with symbolic meaning. The gold thread must be real gold, not gilt, because God deserves authentic materials. The work will be inspected not just for craftsmanship but for spiritual worthiness. Is your heart pure while you work? Have you confessed recently? Did you attend Mass this Sunday? A priest or monk arrives to inspect the commissioned work, and they're looking for evidence of sin in the stitching. Too much pride in your craftsmanship? That's vanity. Work that's too plain and simple? That's slothfully not giving God your best effort. Any tiny flaw becomes evidence of your spiritual inadequacy. And here's the truly insidious part. Church customers often paid slowly or in spiritual currency prayers for your soul, indulgences, blessings. Your master might accept this because refusing church commissions could result in being labeled impious, which is bad for business and potentially dangerous. But prayers don't pay for materials or feed apprentices, so the workshop operates at a loss while being told to be grateful for the opportunity to serve God. Regular townsfolk, your actual sustainable customer base, are exhausting in different ways. They have limited money and unlimited opinions. A good wife comes in needing a pot mended, or cloth for a dress, or new shoes for her children. She will handle every piece of merchandise, question every price, compare your work to your competitor down the street, and ultimately try to negotiate a price that barely covers your material costs. She'll ask for credit, promising to pay after the harvest, after her husband's wages come in, after some vague future event. Your master might extend credit because refusing means losing the sale entirely. But collecting those debts is another nightmare. People who owe money suddenly become very hard to find. These customers also have long memories for grievances. Produce something that breaks or wears out faster than expected, even if it's because they misused it or their expectations were unrealistic, and they'll tell everyone. Medieval towns were small enough that reputation was everything. One dissatisfied customer could poison an entire neighborhood against your workshop. Your master knows this, so he'll often replace items or provide free repairs even when it's not his fault, eating the cost to preserve the workshop's reputation. And guess whose labor provides those free repairs? You, the apprentice, working extra hours for no additional compensation to fix something that wasn't even your mistake. The haggling is relentless and often insulting. A customer will examine a piece of work your master spent days creating and immediately declare it worth half the asking price. They'll point out every minor imperfection, real or imagined. They'll claim that another workshop offers the same quality for less. Whether or not that's true, they'll appeal to poverty, to friendship, to Christian charity, anything to drive the price down. Your master has to engage in this dance because walking away means no sale, but it's degrading, exhausting, and ultimately unprofitable. The final price, after an hour of haggling, often leaves the workshop with barely enough margin to justify the labor. Foreign customers bring their own complications. A trader from another region, or even another country, arrives with different expectations and communication barriers. They want goods produced to standards you've never heard of, using measurements that don't match your local system. They want everything cheaper because they're buying in bulk, but they also want it better because they're taking it somewhere else where it will represent your master's work to a foreign market. The language difficulties mean endless miscommunication. You think they want one thing, produce it, and discover they actually wanted something completely different. But they've already paid a deposit. You've used materials, and now there's a dispute about who bears the loss. Here's a quirky detail that most people don't know. Some customers would deliberately bring impossible or cursed commissions to workshops they disliked, intending to waste the craftsman's time and materials. A rival might send someone to commission an elaborate piece with very specific requirements, pay a deposit, then disappear. Keeping the deposit was illegal, so the workshop had to complete the work or refund money they'd already spent on materials. Or they'd commission something, wait until it was nearly complete, then claim some minor detail violated the agreement and demand a full refund. These practices were technically illegal but hard to prove, and they could devastate a workshop's finances. The nobility's payment practices are particularly terrible. They might take months or years to pay for commissioned work, if they pay at all. Your master can't refuse to deliver the finished goods because offending a noble is dangerous. But he also can't easily collect payment because noblemen consider themselves above such mundane concerns as promptly paying craftsmen. Some workshops maintained accounts receivable money owed to them that exceeded their annual revenue. They were owed more money than they made in a year, tied up in unpaid noble commissions. This creates a desperate cycle, accepting new noble commissions to get deposits to pay for materials for old commissions that still haven't been paid for. The inspection process for any significant commission is humiliating. The customer, their representative, because important people don't do this themselves, examines every aspect of the work while you stand there silently. They run their fingers over surfaces looking for imperfections. They hold cloth up to light, searching for inconsistent weave. They test joints and seams, trying to find weaknesses. Every flaw they discover is a victory for them and a mark of shame for your workshop. Your master stands there accepting criticism, nodding agreement with insults about the quality, promising to fix things that aren't actually broken, all to preserve the relationship and ensure payment. Customer-requested modifications are the bane of existence. They commission something, you produce it exactly to specifications, and then they decide they want changes. A different color, a different size, additional decoration. These changes require redoing work that's already complete, using additional materials, spending more time. But customers often expect these modifications at no additional cost, claiming that getting it right the first time should have been included in the original price. Your master has to negotiate whether he can charge for modifications without offending the customer and losing the sale entirely. The seasonal nature of some trades makes customer relations even more fraught. A tailor or dressmaker has intense busy periods before major holidays or events, when everyone suddenly needs new clothes. Customers show up demanding impossible rush jobs. They need a complete outfit in 3 days for their daughter's wedding. The work normally takes 2 weeks. Your master has to choose between accepting and working everyone to death, or refusing and losing valuable business during the one time of year when people are actually spending money on clothes. Usually he accepts, which means you're working 48-hour stretches trying to meet impossible deadlines. Returns and complaints were handled through guild mediation, which sounds official and fair until you remember the guild is run by masters whose primary concern is protecting the guild's reputation. If a noble complains about quality, the guild will almost always side with the noble, even if the complaint is unjustified, because maintaining good relations with the nobility benefits all guild members. Your master absorbs the loss, and you absorb your master's anger about it. If a common customer complains, the guild might actually investigate fairly, but the process takes weeks or months, during which the disputed payment is held in escrow and your workshop operates without that income. The emotional labor of dealing with customers is never acknowledged but always present. Your master has to be obsequious to nobles, friendly but firm with merchants, patient with commoners, and reverent with church officials, all while managing his actual feelings of frustration, contempt, or anger. As an apprentice, you witness this constant performance. You see the smile fade the moment the customer leaves, replaced by cursing or despair. You learn that business relationships are fundamentally dishonest. You pretend respect you don't feel, promise quality you can't deliver, and smile through insults because the alternative is poverty. The customer is always right, not because they actually are, but because they have something you desperately need: money. And in medieval economy, money is scarce enough that you'll endure almost any indignity, meet almost any unreasonable demand, and absorb almost any loss to get it. You're watching your Mistura skilled craftsman, a guild member, a man of some standing in the communitide base himself repeatedly for customers who view him as barely better than a servant. And you know that if you survive to become a master yourself, this will be your life too. The tools and materials might harm your body, but the customers destroy something deeper: your dignity, your pride in your work, your sense of self-worth. They reduce you to a thing that produces other things for their use, and your value exists only in that function. You're finally getting competent at your trade. Your hands have developed the calluses and muscle memory to work efficiently. You can anticipate what the master needs before he asks. You're starting to take pride in your work, believing that maybe you'll survive this apprenticeship after all. And then everything falls apart, because medieval workshops existed in a state of perpetual crisis where catastrophe was always one bad day away. Fire is the ever-present terror. You're working in a wooden building, often with a thatched roof, surrounded by flammable materials: cloth, wood shavings, straw, oil, while using open flames for light, heat, and actual work. The forge is essentially a controlled fire that could become uncontrolled in seconds. Candles tip over. Sparks from metalworking land in places they shouldn't. A pot of boiling oil used for everything from quenching metal to treating leather spills and ignites. Medieval cities burned regularly. Entire neighborhoods reduced to ash in hours. And workshops were where many of these fires started. When fire breaks out, there's no fire department coming to save you. There's a bucket brigade if you're lucky, neighbors and guild members passing buckets of water in a chain that's never quite fast enough. The priority is stopping the fire from spreading to other buildings, not saving yours. You grab what you can carry. Tools are valuable, materials less so because they're bulkier, and you run. Everything else burns. The workshop, the tools you couldn't carry, the materials, the work in progress, the customer commissions that were nearly complete. It's all gone. Your master has lost everything he's built over years or decades. And here's the medieval reality. There's no insurance, no disaster relief, no government assistance. He's simply ruined. Some masters recover by borrowing money at interest rates that would make modern loan sharks blush. 20, 30, even 50% annually. They mortgage their future earnings, commit to terms that make it nearly impossible to ever get out of debt, all for the chance to rebuild. Others don't recover. They become journeymen again, working for other masters, or they leave the trade entirely, joining the ranks of unskilled laborers. The apprentices in a burned workshop are in limbo. Their contracts are with a master who can no longer house, feed, or train them. Some contracts transfer to other masters, but there's no guarantee. You might find yourself released from your apprenticeship with years left to serve and no compensation. Your family's investment in your training simply evaporated like the smoke from the fire. Here's something historians still argue about: whether the frequency of workshop fires was primarily due to unavoidable hazards of medieval technology, or if negligence and cost-cutting by masters trying to maximize profits played a significant role. Guild records show that workshops cited for safety violations: storing too much flammable material, blocking exits, inadequate fire buckets frequently burned within months of the citation. But enforcement was minimal because the same masters who owned workshops also controlled the guilds that would punish violations. Theft is another constant threat, and it comes from multiple directions. Thieves target workshops because tools and materials have value and are relatively portable. A set of quality chisels, a bolt of fine cloth, raw metal stock. These can be fenced quickly in any medieval city's thriving black market. Workshops try to secure their goods, but medieval locks are primitive and easily picked or broken. Many workshops have apprentices sleep in the workspace, partly for this reason, a guard dog who happens to also provide labor. If thieves break in while you're sleeping and you don't wake up or can't stop them, that's your fault. You'll be beaten for failing to protect the master's property, even if you're a scrawny 14-year-old facing armed adults. Internal theft is worse because it's harder to prevent and more personally devastating. A journeyman, underpaid and resentful, starts pocketing small amounts of material, a bit of gold leaf here, some expensive dye there. Over months, it adds up to significant loss, but because it's gradual, it's hard to detect. Apprentices steal too, usually food because they're always hungry, but sometimes tools or materials they think won't be missed. When theft is discovered, everyone is suspected. The atmosphere becomes poisonous with mistrust, and punishments are collective. Everyone suffers reduced rations or increased work hours until the thief confesses or is caught. Often the real thief is never found, but someone gets blamed anyway because the master needs someone to punish. Customers occasionally engage in what amounts to legal theft. They commission expensive work, receive it, then claim it's defective and demand a refund while keeping the goods. Or they commission something, pay a deposit, then declare bankruptcy before taking delivery. Your master has the finished work but no customer and no final payment, while the deposit has already been spent on materials. Some customers are serial commission and vanish artists, moving from workshop to workshop, collecting goods on credit they never intend to pay. The guild supposedly tracks these people, but enforcement is inconsistent, and by the time warnings circulate, the scammer has already victimized multiple workshops. Plague arrives with no warning and no mercy. You might wake up one morning with the first symptoms: fever, swellings in your groin or armpits, or you might find the person sleeping next to you already dead, their body covered in the dark blotches that give the Black Death its name. Plague doesn't care about your apprenticeship contract or your master's customer commitments. Kills indiscriminately. Apprentices, journeymen, masters, customers, guild officials. A workshop might lose half its workforce in a week. The survivors face impossible choices. Continue working in close quarters where the disease clearly spreads, or abandon the workshop and lose their livelihood. The economic impact of plague extends beyond immediate deaths. Customers die, taking their promised payments with them. Suppliers die, cutting off material sources. The demand for certain goods collapses. Nobody needs fancy clothes during a plague outbreak, while demand for other things skyrockets. Plain coffins become the most valuable commodity in the city. Masters who pivoted production might survive. Those who didn't, or couldn't because their skills weren't transferable, went under. Apprenticeships were voided en masse as masters fled cities or died. Boys who'd served 5 or 6 years of their 7-year terms found themselves without masters, their nearly complete training rendered worthless because there was no one left to certify their completion. War brings its own disasters. Medieval warfare often involved besieging cities, which meant your town might be cut off from supply routes for months. No raw materials coming in, no finished goods going out. The workshop burns through whatever reserves it has, then sits idle while still needing to pay rent and feed people. Or the city gets sack soldiers from either side. because occupying armies and defending forces both loot and workshops are prime targets. Soldiers take tools for their utility, materials for their value, and destroy what they can't carry out of general destructive enthusiasm. Some medieval cities were sacked multiple times within a generation. Imagine rebuilding your workshop after a fire, only to have it looted by an army 3 years later, then burned again in the fighting 4 years after that. Economic collapse operates on longer timescales but is equally destructive. A major customer, the church, the local nobility, a wealthy merchant family goes bankrupt or dies without heirs. Suddenly, the contracts that represented 30% of your workshop's revenue vanish. Or a trade route gets disrupted by war or piracy, cutting off supplies of essential materials. Or a cheaper source of goods opens up, maybe another region starts producing the same items at lower cost, and demand for your workshop's products evaporates. Your master has decades of skill and experience in a trade that's suddenly not profitable enough to sustain a workshop. Currency debasement was a particular medieval nightmare. Kings and nobles would recall coins, melt them down, mix in cheaper metals, and reissue them at the same face value. Your savings coins you've hoarded to eventually buy your way into master status suddenly by half or a quarter of what they did before. Contracts written in terms of currency amounts become worthless when the currency itself is debased. A customer who agreed to pay 100 silver pennies for a commission might technically fulfill that obligation with debased coins worth 50 pennies in actual silver content. And there's nothing you can do about it. Here's a quirky detail most people don't know. Some workshops maintained hidden reserves, emergency caches of tools and materials buried or hidden in walls specifically because disaster was so common. If the workshop burned or was looted, these reserves might survive, giving the master a foundation for rebuilding. But maintaining these reserves meant diverting resources that could have been used for production or quality of life improvements. It was disaster insurance that cost you comfort in the present to possibly help in a future catastrophe. Succession crises could destroy workshops overnight. A master dies suddenly, disease, accident, violence, and the workshop's future becomes uncertain. If he had a son trained in the trade, the son might take over, though he'd need guild approval and might face resistance from journeymen who think they deserve the position. If the master had only a widow, some guilds allowed her to keep operating the workshop if she married another guild member within a certain time frame. If she didn't or couldn't, the workshop was dissolved, assets sold, apprentices and journeymen dispersed. Years of relationship building with customers, suppliers, and guild officials evaporated because one person died. Partnerships between masters could implode catastrophically. Two masters might join resources to handle larger contracts or share expensive equipment. When things go well, everyone benefits. When they go badly, one master dies, or they disagree about business decisions, or one is secretly embezzling. The dissolution is ugly. Assets have to be divided, but how do you split a forge or a loom? Customers have to choose which master to continue patronizing. Apprentices contracted to the partnership find themselves in legal limbo. These disputes often ended up in guild arbitration or even secular courts, processes that took months or years while the workshop stagnated. Natural disasters hit without warning. A storm tears the roof off the workshop, exposing everything to weather damage. A flood. Medieval cities were often built near rivers for water and transport, inundates ground floor workshops, ruining materials and tools. Earthquakes, more common in some regions than others, collapse buildings. These events were seen as acts of God. which meant they were simultaneously random and deserved. God was clearly punishing someone for something, though who and what was always debatable. Masters might interpret disaster as divine judgment on their sins and respond by becoming more religiously stringent, making everyone's life even more miserable with additional prayers and fasting. The compounding effect of disasters is what really destroys people. One catastrophe might be survivably you borrow money, rebuild, recover over time, but medieval life had a way of piling disasters on top of each other. Fire followed by plague, war followed by economic collapse, theft during a period when you're already struggling from customer defaults. Each disaster makes you more vulnerable to the next. Your reserves are depleted, your credit is extended, your resilience is exhausted. The second or third disaster hits a workshop that's already weakened, and there's nothing left to draw on. The psychological impact of living in constant anticipation of catastrophe cannot be overstated. You know, with certainty, that something will go wrong. You don't know what or when, but you know it's coming. Fire, theft, plague, or economic collapse. The question isn't if but which one and how soon. This creates a pervasive anxiety that underlies everything. You can't fully invest in the future because the future might be ashes. You can't build security because security is an illusion in a world where everything can disappear overnight. Some people respond with religious fatalism. It's all God's will. Accept what comes. Others develop a kind of manic present focus. Extract what profit and pleasure you can right now because tomorrow it might all be gone. The survivors of multiple disasters develop a haunted quality in historical records. Letters and diaries from merchants and craftsmen who lived through fires, plagues, and wars describe a kind of emotional numbing. They've lost so much so many times that they struggle to care about anything. They go through the motions of rebuilding, not because they believe it will last, but because the alternative is giving up entirely. Some describe a sense of being already dead, just waiting for their bodies to catch up to their spirits. You're standing in this workshop right now, during what passes for a good period. No active disasters, just the normal grinding misery of medieval craft work. But you can feel it, the precariousness of everything, the tools that could be confiscated tomorrow, the materials that could burn tonight, the master whose death could void your apprenticeship, the customers whose bankruptcy could destroy the workshop's finances, the plague that could arrive next week, the war that could reach your city next month. Nothing is stable, nothing is secure, and the 7 years you're supposed to spend here learning a trade might end at any moment in catastrophe that erases everything you've worked for. The disaster hasn't happened yet, but in a very real sense, you're always living in the space between catastrophes, where the question isn't if but when and how bad this time. The master craftsman who owns this workshop, the man whose approval you desperately seek, whose anger you constantly fear, whose skills represent everything you're supposed to become, is not your ally. He's not even really your teacher in any meaningful sense. He's an economic actor who's purchased your labor at bargain rates and will extract every possible ounce of value from your body before your contract expires. And standing between you and him, making your life even more complicated, is a whole hierarchy of people whose existence is predicated on keeping you at the bottom. Let's start with the master himself, because understanding him is crucial to understanding why your suffering is systematic rather than personal. He's probably in his late 30s or early 40s, which makes him elderly by medieval standards. Most people didn't live much past 50, and craftsmen often died younger due to occupational hazards. He's missing parts of fingers. His back is bent from decades of work. He might be partially deaf from years of hammering or machinery noise. His body is a preview of your future if you survive. He achieved master status after his own brutal apprenticeship and years as a journeyman, probably going into debt to pay the guild fees and establish this workshop. He's been grinding for 25 or 30 years, and he's tired. But here's the crucial thing. His financial situation is probably desperate. The workshop might look successful to you, tools everywhere, materials stocked, steady work, but medieval businesses operated on razor-thin margins. Your master likely has debts to suppliers, money owed to the guild for various fees, rent or mortgage on the workshop space, and constant pressure to maintain production levels. You represent one of his few reliable cost savings. He's paid your parents a one-time fee and now gets your labor for 7 years for just the cost of feeding and housing you at subsistence levels. Your suffering is his profit margin. This economic pressure makes him cruel in predictable ways. He can't afford patience when you make mistakes because mistakes cost money he doesn't have. He can't afford time spent teaching you carefully because time is inventory, and inventory is wealth. The beatings, the criticism, the impossible standards, these aren't personal failures of character. They're rational responses to his economic reality. You're a resource to be exploited, and resources don't get gentle treatment. Historians still argue about whether medieval masters genuinely believed harsh treatment produced better craftsmen, or if they simply didn't care as long as production continued. But the outcome was the same either way. The master's family adds another layer of complication. His wife often works in the workshop too, especially in textile trades where women's labor was essential. She might actually be more skilled than him in certain aspects. Medieval women were often the primary dyers, spinners, or embroiderers, but she'll never be a guild master because guilds were almost exclusively male. She resents this, resents her husband's authority that comes purely from gender rather than skill, and she sometimes takes that resentment out on you, where she might be kind, sneaking you extra food when the master isn't looking. But even that kindness is dangerous because accepting it means owing her loyalty, and loyalty is a currency she might collect on in ways you don't anticipate. The master's children, if he has any who survived infancy, which is a big if given medieval child mortality rates, are your competitors and tormentors. Sons are being groomed to take over the workshop, receiving preferential teaching and easier tasks. They know they're inheriting this business, so they have no incentive to treat you well. In fact, establishing dominance over apprentices is part of their training in being masters. They'll order you around despite being years younger. They'll blame you for their mistakes, and they'll be believed over you every time because blood matters more than truth. Daughters might be around the workshop too, and you're forbidden from any romantic or sexual interaction with them on pain of expulsion from your apprenticeship. But they know this, and some enjoy the power of being able to destroy your future with a single accusation, true or false. Now let's talk about the journeymen, because they occupy a special place in the hierarchy of your suffering. These are men who've completed their apprenticeships, proven their skills, and now work for wages. They're supposed to be teaching you, guiding you, helping you develop the skills you'll need. In reality, they're bitter, trapped men taking out their frustration on the only people below them in the social order, you and the other apprentices. A journeyman is stuck. He has the skills to be a master but lacks the capital, guild connections, or sheer luck needed to establish his own workshop. He might be a journeyman for 5 years, 10 years, even his entire working life. He earns wages that are carefully calculated by guild regulations to be just enough to survive but never enough to accumulate the savings needed for master status. He watches masters, some of whom are less skilled than he, is profit from his labor while he remains permanently subordinate. This creates a rage that has to go somewhere, and it goes downward, onto you. The journeyman's teaching method is sabotage disguised as instruction. He'll show you a technique once, quickly, while doing it himself, then berate you for not mastering it instantly. He'll give you the worst tools, claiming it's good practice to work with damaged equipment, when really he's reserving the good tools for himself. He'll assign you tasks that are set up to fail, asking you to achieve results that require tools or materials you don't have access to, and mock you when you predictably fail. This isn't random cruelty, it's strategic. The longer you remain incompetent, the longer he remains necessary. If you become skilled too quickly, you're a threat to his position. Here's a quirky detail most people don't know. Some journeymen formed unofficial alliances with specific apprentices, essentially creating patron-client relationships within the workshop. A journeyman might protect his apprentice from the worst abuses, provide actual teaching, and ensure that apprentice succeeded in exchange for loyalty, unpaid assistance with the journeyman's personal work, and sometimes a share of any future success if the apprentice eventually became a master. But getting selected for this kind of protection was arbitrary, based on the journeyman's whims, family connections, or even just whether he liked your face. If you weren't chosen, you faced the full force of journeyman hostility with no buffer. The senior apprentices are perhaps your most immediate threat. These are boys or young men who've been in the workshop for 4, 5, 6 years. They've survived everything you're going through now, and survival has made them mean. The apprentice hierarchy is rigid and enforced through violence. Senior apprentices have the right informal but absolutetto command junior apprentices. Take their food, assign them the worst tasks, and punish them for any perceived disrespect. This isn't acknowledged openly, but it's understood by everyone, including the master, who allows it because it maintains order and saves him the trouble of directly managing every apprentice. A senior apprentice approaching the end of his term is especially dangerous. He's desperate to prove himself worthy of journeyman status, which means he needs to demonstrate superiority. He does this by making you fail. He'll contaminate your work, a bit of moisture on metal you're about to forge, causing dangerous steam explosions and ruined pieces. He'll hide essential tools right before you need them. He'll whisper wrong instructions, then watch you follow them and face the master's wrath. And if you complain, you're the problem. You're weak. You can't handle workshop life. Maybe you're not cut out for this trade. The senior apprentice's word carries weight because he's proven himself by surviving. You're nobody. The other junior apprentices, your peers in this misery, are not your friends. They can't be. You're all competing for limited resources, the master's attention and approval, access to the best tools, assignment to important tasks that teach valuable skills. Every success you have potentially comes at their expense. If the master praises you, it implies criticism of them. If you master a technique quickly, it makes them look slow, so they undermine you subtly, not sharing information, accidentally ruining your work, spreading rumors that you're lazy or dishonest. Trust between apprentices is suicidal because today's ally might be tomorrow's betrayer if the master offers him a slightly better position. The workshop foreman, if the operation is large enough to have one, represents yet another layer of control. This is usually a senior journeyman who's been given supervisory authority. He's not quite a master but has power over everyone below him, which he wields with the enthusiasm of someone who's finally found someone to dominate after years of being dominated. The foreman is incentivized to maximize productivity and minimize costs, which means driving everyone harder while spending less on maintenance, safety, and worker welfare. He reports directly to the master, and his reports determine who gets the worst tasks, who gets punished, who might be dismissed. Staying in his good graces requires constant deference that goes beyond what you show the master. At least the master is genuinely superior in the hierarchy. But the foreman is barely above you, which makes the required subservience even more galling. Guild inspectors, while not part of the daily workshop hierarchy, are periodic visitors who can destroy your life on a whim. They arrive unannounced to check compliance with guild regulations, proper materials, correct techniques, no unauthorized innovations. An inspector might dislike your master for political reasons, and he'll take it out on the workshop by finding violations real or imagined. Apprentices are convenient scapegoats. This shoddy work must be from undertrained apprentices. Are you failing in your teaching duties, Master? Now you're the excuse for whatever punishment the inspector wants to levy, and the master will absolutely throw you under that cart to save himself. The real cruelty of this hierarchy is that everyone in it is both victim and perpetrator. The master beats you because he was beaten. The journeyman sabotages you because he was sabotaged. The senior apprentice torments you because he was tormented. Everyone's suffering is simultaneously genuine and used to justify inflicting suffering on others. It's a self-perpetuating system where yesterday's victims become today's abusers, and the abuse is so normalized that people genuinely believe it's educational, that it builds character, that it's the only way to properly train craftsmen. Historians examining guild records and workshop documentation have found evidence of what we might now call institutionalized hazing. Certain workshops had formal or informal initiation rituals where new apprentices were subjected to specific torments, being sent to fetch imaginary tools, being tricked into dangerous tasks, being humiliated in front of customers. These weren't random bullying. They were traditions, passed down from generation to generation, considered essential to breaking in new apprentices. Some guilds even had records of these practices, describing them in neutral or positive terms as important parts of craft education. The intersecting hierarchies create impossible loyalty conflicts. You're supposed to obey the master absolutely, but also follow journeyman instructions, and also submit to senior apprentice authority, and also comply with guild regulations enforced by inspectors. When these authorities contradict each other, and they frequently doyery-trapped, follow the journeyman's instruction that violates a guild rule, and the inspector punishes you. Follow the guild rule and disobey the journeyman, and he makes your life hell. There's no right choice, only various forms of punishment. The ultimate crushing realization is that this hierarchy exists not to teach you a trade, but to teach you subordination. The actual craft skills could be taught much more efficiently with patient instruction and practice. But the medieval workshop isn't optimized for education. It's optimized for control. You're being trained to accept your place, to never question authority, to internalize the idea that suffering is normal and resistance is futile. The craft skills are almost secondary to this lesson in submission. You look around the workshop and see this pyramid of misery. The master crushed by economic pressure, the journeyman trapped by limited opportunity, the senior apprentices desperate to prove themselves, your fellow junior apprentices willing to betray you for the smallest advantage, and you at the bottom, supporting the weight of everyone above. And you understand with horrible clarity that if you survive to climb this hierarchy, you'll become exactly what you currently hate. The beaten apprentice becomes the beating journeyman, becomes the cruel master, and the system continues, grinding bodies and souls into profit and power for the small elite at the top who've structured everything to keep it this way. So why did anyone endure this? Why didn't medieval apprentices simply run away, return to their villages, accept peasant life rather than submit to this mechanical destruction of body and spirit? The answer is complicated, dark, and ultimately reveals something fundamental about medieval society that makes the workshop system almost rational despite its horrors. Let's start with the alternative, peasant life. You need to understand what your parents were saving you from when they paid that enormous apprenticeship fee and sent you away. A peasant farmer in medieval Europe lived in a one-room cottage shared with livestock literally. Animals lived inside the house for warmth and because there was nowhere else to keep them. The smell alone would make the toxic workshop air seem pleasant by comparison. You'd own maybe one change of clothes, eat the same grain porridge for 90% of your meals, and face periodic famines where you'd boil leather or eat grass just to have something in your stomach. But the real horror of peasant life was the complete absence of control or hope. You were bound to the land, property of the Lord who owned that land, forbidden from leaving without permission that would never be granted. Your labor belonged to someone else, typically 3 or 4 days per week working the Lord's fields, not your own. The remaining days you frantically tried to grow enough food to keep your family alive, knowing that poor weather, blight, or simple bad luck could mean starvation. There was no possibility of advancement, no chance your children would have better lives. Nothing but the same grinding poverty generation after generation until your family line ended in some plague or famine. The workshop, for all its brutality, offered something peasant life never could, the possibility of escape from that cycle. An apprentice who survived and became a master craftsman entered a different social class entirely. Not nobility, let's be clear about that, but something genuinely higher than peasantry. A master craftsman could own property, participate in town governance, marry into merchant families, ensure his children received education or trade training. The suffering of apprenticeship was the price of admission to a world where your descendants might not be property. Medieval people understood this calculation explicitly. Parents who apprenticed their children weren't ignorant of the suffering awaiting them. They'd seen apprentices in their towns, knew the conditions, heard the stories. They sent their children anyway because the alternative was worse. It was a brutal form of love, accepting your child's suffering in the present to give them a chance at a better future. Some historians argue this represents a kind of medieval pragmatism that modern people struggle to understand, the willingness to accept terrible means for potentially better ends when all available options are terrible anyway. The guild system, despite being oppressive and exploitative, did provide genuine benefits that weren't available elsewhere. Guild membership meant legal protections, contracts were enforced, customers couldn't simply refuse payment, and there were established processes for resolving disputes. A guild craftsman who was wronged by a noble still probably wouldn't get justice, but at least there was a framework for trying. A peasant who was wronged by a noble had no recourse at all. The guild also provided a form of social insurance. If a master died, his widow and children received some support from guild funds. If a master was injured and couldn't work, the guild might provide temporary assistance. This wasn't generous, it was minimal support designed to prevent guild members from becoming public charity cases, but it was more than non-guild members received, which was nothing. The craft itself provided a form of satisfaction that's difficult to explain to people who've never created something with their hands. Yes, the conditions were horrific. The tools were dangerous. The customers were nightmares. And the hierarchy was crushing. But when you successfully completed a piece of work, when you forged a blade that held its edge, wove cloth with perfect consistency, or joined wood so seamlessly the joints were invisible, there was a pride in that accomplishment that transcended the suffering. You'd made something that didn't exist before, used skill and knowledge to transform raw materials into objects of use and sometimes beauty. For people whose lives offered very few sources of pride or accomplishment, this was significant. Medieval craftsmen developed a kind of professional identity that was tied to their trade in ways modern people rarely experience. A blacksmith wasn't just someone who worked with metal. He was a blacksmith, fundamentally, in his self-conception. This identity came with community. Other blacksmiths understood your struggles, spoke your technical language, appreciated your skills. Guild feasts and celebrations, for all the hierarchy and politics, were occasions where craftsmen could gather with peers who understood them. This sense of belonging to something larger than yourself, of being part of a tradition stretching back generations and forward into the future, provided meaning that made the suffering more bearable. Here's something historians still debate: whether the pride medieval craftsmen took in their work was genuine satisfaction or a psychological coping mechanism that helped them rationalize their exploitation. The evidence suggests it was probably both. People are remarkably good at finding meaning in suffering when the alternative is despair. Craftsmen convinced themselves that their work mattered, that their skills were valuable, that their trade was honorable, and these beliefs were simultaneously true and also convenient justifications for a system that was grinding them into dust. The religious framework of medieval society provided another layer of rationalization. Suffering was understood as spiritually valuable. Christ suffered, saints suffered, and your suffering in the workshop could be offered up as a form of devotion. This wasn't just hollow propaganda. Many people genuinely believed it. A devout apprentice might interpret his beatings and hardships as trials that purified his soul, opportunities to practice patience and humility, ways to earn salvation. The worse the suffering, the greater the spiritual reward. This belief system transformed meaningless pain into meaningful sacrifice, which is a powerful psychological tool for endurance. The guilds actively promoted this religious interpretation. Many had patron saints and held religious festivals where the connection between craft and divine will was reinforced. Saint Joseph, as a carpenter, was patron to woodworkers. Saint Eligius, a goldsmith, protected metal workers. These weren't just symbolic associations. They were theological arguments that your trade was part of God's plan. Your work was holy service, and your suffering had cosmic significance. Whether this was cynical manipulation by guild leaders or genuine belief is unclear, probably some of both, but it helped people endure conditions that might otherwise have driven them to rebellion or despair. Social mobility, limited as it was still more than many alternatives offered. A talented apprentice from a peasant family could, through decades of suffering and luck, become a master with his own workshop, marry into a merchant family, and see his children educated or apprenticed into even more prestigious trades. This happened rarely enough to be remarkable, but often enough to maintain hope. Every workshop had stories, probably exaggerated off apprentices who'd risen to great heights. These stories functioned as medieval lottery fantasies, statistically unlikely but possible enough to keep people playing the game. The economic benefits for successful masters were substantial enough to justify the prior suffering. At least in retrospect, a master craftsman in a prosperous city could earn income equivalent to a minor noble, could afford a comfortable house, could eat meat regularly, could own books and other luxury items. The gap between master craftsman and peasant farmer was the gap between two different universes of experience. Men who'd endured brutal apprenticeships and years as journeymen could look at their eventual success and tell themselves it was worth it, conveniently forgetting or minimizing the many who died or were broken along the way. Here's a quirky detail that reveals the psychology. Many successful masters became the harshest enforcers of the very system that had brutalized them. They didn't reform working conditions or treat their apprentices better. They perpetuated the same abuse they'd experienced. Some historians interpret this as identification with the aggressor, a psychological pattern where victims adopt their abusers' perspectives to cope with trauma. Others see it as rational economic behavior. The system worked for them, so why change it? Probably both explanations have merit. The result was a self-reinforcing cycle where each generation of craftsmen became the next generation's tormentors. The absence of alternatives is crucial to understanding why people stayed. Running away from an apprenticeship meant returning to peasant life or becoming an urban vagrant. Vagrants were illegal in most medieval jurisdictions. You needed to be attached to a household or have a recognized occupation. A runaway apprentice would be arrested and returned, or, if he managed to stay free, would live in constant fear of discovery, unable to practice his trade legally, reduced to begging or crime. Some did run away despite this, but most calculated that enduring the apprenticeship, however terrible, was better than the alternatives. The communal enforcement of the guild system meant that resistance was almost impossible. If you complained too much about conditions, you were labeled a troublemaker and found yourself unemployable. If you tried to organize other apprentices to demand better treatment, you'd be expelled and possibly face criminal charges for disturbing the peace. The guild, the town government, the church, and the broader social order all aligned to maintain the system. Resistance wasn't just difficult. It was structurally impossible for individuals without resources or allies. Women faced even grimmer calculations. A girl from a peasant family might be apprenticed to a weaver or dressmaker, facing all the same brutality as male apprentices plus sexual vulnerability. But the alternatives: early marriage to another peasant, domestic service in a noble household, or prostitution were often worse. The workshop at least offered a path to becoming a master craftswoman, though guild rules usually restricted women masters to widows who'd inherited workshops from their husbands. It wasn't fair, it wasn't equal, but it was better than the alternatives available to medieval women, which is a low bar but still mattered to the people making these choices. The intergenerational perspective was important. Parents who'd suffered through apprenticeships themselves could reassure their children that survival was possible, that the suffering ended eventually, that the benefits were worth it. This wasn't necessarily true. Plenty of apprentices died or were permanently disabled, but the survivors believed it, and belief was enough to keep the system functioning. Each generation passed down the trauma and the coping mechanisms, creating a culture where extreme suffering in youth was normalized as the price of adult stability. The creative and intellectual aspects of craft work provided satisfaction that purely physical labor didn't. A master craftsman solved problems: how to achieve a particular color in dye, how to forge a complex shape, how to join materials in new ways. This problem-solving engaged the mind in ways that plowing a field or hauling stone never could. For people who might otherwise never have any outlet for intellectual curiosity, craft work provided a form of mental stimulation that made life more bearable. The apprentice years were brutal, but they were also a kind of education unavailable to peasants, teaching not just specific skills but general principles of materials, tools, and creative problem solving. The ultimate reason people endured is perhaps the simplest, because the only thing worse than suffering with hope is suffering without it. The workshop offered hope, slim, brutal, purchased with years of pain, but genuine, hope that you'd survive, become skilled, achieve master status, earn a decent living, raise children who wouldn't be serfs. For medieval people trapped between various forms of misery, choosing the misery that came with hope was rational. Even if the hope was mostly illusion, you're still standing in this workshop, body aching, lungs full of toxic air, surrounded by hostile hierarchies and dangerous tools, and now you understand why you'll probably stay despite everything. Not because it's good, it's terrible. Not because you want to leave tomorrow if there were anywhere to go, but because this terrible situation is still, somehow, better than the alternatives available to someone of your class in medieval society. The workshop is a prison, but it's a prison with a possible release date and a chance, however small, at something better beyond these walls. And so you endure. You breathe the poison, accept the beatings, survive on insufficient food, work with dangerous tools, submit to the crushing hierarchy, live in constant fear of disaster, and tell yourself it's worth it. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but you'll never know unless you survive long enough to find out. So you put your head down, grip the tool in your damaged hands, and continue working. The light outside is fading now. The workday is finally approaching its end. Soon the evening bell will ring, and you'll stumble to your straw pallet, too exhausted to even properly appreciate the rest. Tomorrow you'll wake before dawn and do it all again. And the day after that. And the day after that. For 7 years. Or until something breaks the system, your body, or your spirit. But tonight, as sleep claims you with the weight of complete physical exhaustion, there's a tiny ember of something that might be hope. Maybe you will survive this. Maybe you will master the skills. Maybe you will achieve something that makes it all worthwhile. It's not much, this hope. It's not even particularly rational. But it's enough to get you through one more day. And in medieval life, that's all anyone can really ask for. The workshop settles into silence as the last light fades. The tools rest, waiting for tomorrow's work. The forge cools to a sullen glow. The toxic air slowly dissipates through cracks and windows. And you, along with the other apprentices, sink into sleep, not the peaceful rest of the content, but the absolute collapse of those who have nothing left to give. Your body begins its nightly attempt to repair the day's damage, knowing it will never quite finish before tomorrow brings fresh destruction. This is medieval workshop life. This is what you endured to learn a trade, to escape peasantry, to give your future children a chance at something better. It was brutal, exploitative, dangerous, and soul-crushing, and yet people did it, generation after generation, because in a world of limited and terrible options, it was somehow still worth choosing. The workshop didn't just shape metal or wood or clot, it shaped people, forged them through suffering into something harder, more resilient, and perhaps irreparably damaged, but capable, always, ultimately, capable. The darkness is complete now. The workshop breathes in its sleep, a living thing made of wood and stone and the accumulated suffering of everyone who's ever worked within its walls. And somewhere in that darkness, you're already dreaming of the morning bell, of waking too early, of facing another impossible day. Because that's what you do. That's what everyone does. You endure.